It wasn't the seating plan itself that shocked the room, it was the silence that followed. As Prince Edward rose from his chair, eyes fixed ahead and jaw set in quiet defiance, the weight of centuries seemed to hang in the air. No announcement, no explanation, just a departure that said everything the palace refused to. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The state dinner had unfolded with all the precision expected of an institution built on ritual and symbolism, a gathering where every movement was measured and every detail carefully controlled. Leaders, dignitaries, and senior figures from across the world had gathered under the unspoken understanding that what they were witnessing was not merely hospitality, it was hierarchy in motion. And at the center of it all was a seating arrangement so meticulously crafted that even the smallest adjustment carried meaning. Yet on this night, felt different, something that even seasoned observers struggled to immediately define. As conversations softened and glances began to linger longer than usual, the arrangement itself became impossible to ignore. Queen Camilla was placed in a position that drew attention not loudly, not dramatically, but unmistakably higher than many had anticipated. It wasn't overt, yet it was enough. Enough to raise eyebrows among those who understood the silent language of royal protocol. And then there was Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, whose placement, though still within the structure of importance, appeared subtly diminished in comparison. It was a shift so slight that it could be dismissed by the untrained eye, yet to those familiar with the delicate balance of rank and recognition, it spoke volumes. Reports would later suggest that several aides exchanged uneasy glances in those early moments, their expressions betraying a quiet awareness that something had been altered, something that did not align with long-standing expectations. What followed was not immediate chaos, but something far more unsettling: restraint. The room did not erupt, no voices were raised, and no protocol was openly challenged. Instead, a ripple of tension moved silently across the table, carried in fleeting eye contact and measured pauses between sentences. Edward's reaction came not as an outburst, but as a decision swift, controlled, and final. Those closest to him would later be described as noticing a shift in his demeanor even before he stood, a tightening of composure that suggested the moment had already been decided long before anyone realized it was unfolding. When he rose, it was not abrupt, but it was undeniable. Conversations faltered, attention shifted, and for a brief second, the carefully maintained illusion of effortless order fractured. Observers, both within the room and beyond it, would later struggle to categorize what they had witnessed. Some described it as a breach of expectation, others as a quiet protest, and a few, those more familiar with the undercurrents of royal life, hinted at something deeper, something that had been building beneath the surface for far longer than anyone outside those walls could fully understand. Because in a setting where every detail is deliberate, nothing happens without reason. And this, as many would soon come to believe, was no simple oversight. But this wasn't just about a chair at a dinner, it was about something far deeper. Something that had been quietly building behind palace doors. Seating plans in royal circles are never accidental, they are statements of power, hierarchy, and intent. So when Queen Camilla appeared elevated above Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, insiders didn't see a mistake, they saw a message. And that message, according to whispers within palace corridors, had been months in the making. Because within the monarchy, placement is never just about proximity, it is about precedence. And precedence is power. Every chair, every distance, every alignment reflects an invisible code that has been shaped over generations. One that dictates not only who stands where, but who matters most in that moment. And for those who understand that code, even the smallest deviation can feel like a deliberate shift in balance. For years, Sophie had occupied a position that, while understated, carried immense weight within the inner workings of the royal structure. She was never the loudest voice, never the most publicly dominant presence, but her consistency had built something far more enduring: trust. Reports suggest that within the firm, her role had quietly expanded over time, especially during periods of transition, becoming a stabilizing force when uncertainty threatened to unsettle the institution. Those familiar with palace operations often described her as dependable, measured, and deeply aligned with the values the monarchy strives to project. And that is precisely why her placement on this particular evening felt so unusual. It wasn't that she had been excluded, far from it, but rather that her positioning signaled a subtle recalibration, one that seemed to suggest a shift in internal priorities. At the same time, Camilla's position had been evolving in ways that many were still trying to fully understand. Since the coronation of King Charles III, her role had grown more visible, more central, and, according to various interpretations, more influential. Insiders whisper that this transformation had not been entirely organic. Instead, it was shaped by a series of calculated adjustments, each one carefully introduced. Each one gradually redefining her standing within the royal hierarchy. What once might have been seen as a supportive role had, over time, taken on a more commanding presence, and with that shift came inevitable friction. Because in an institution where tradition is both shield and structure, change is never neutral, it is disruptive. Reports began to surface, quietly at first, of internal disagreements over rank and recognition. Nothing confirmed, nothing officially acknowledged, but enough to create an undercurrent of unease. Staff, it is said, had grown increasingly cautious during the planning stages of major events, aware that even routine decisions were now subject to heightened scrutiny. The seating arrangement for the state dinner, according to those familiar with the process, had undergone several revisions. Adjustments were made, then reconsidered, then altered again. And with each change, the sense that something larger was at play became harder to ignore. Because when plans shift at the last moment, it is rarely without reason. By the time the final arrangement was set, those involved reportedly understood that the outcome would not go unnoticed. Yet the decision stood. Whether driven by intention, pressure, or a complex mix of both, it created a moment that would ripple far beyond the room itself. What appeared, on the surface, as a simple matter of placement had, in reality, exposed a deeper tension, one that had been quietly forming between different parts of the royal household. A tension not loud enough to break protocol, but strong enough to challenge it. And for Prince Edward, this wasn't just protocol, it was personal. Prince Edward has spent decades saying very little and doing everything expected of him. But those who know the quiet rhythms of royal life say there is a line even he would never allow to be crossed. And on this night, in full view of the world, that line was unmistakably breached. For years, Prince Edward had built a reputation not through dramatic gestures or public declarations, but through consistency. He was the royal who didn't demand attention, who didn't challenge the system, who understood instinctively that his role was to support, to stabilize, to endure. While others found themselves at the center of headlines and controversy, Edward remained steady, almost invisible in his reliability. And yet, that very restraint made what happened next impossible to ignore. Because when someone who rarely reacts chooses to act, it is never without reason. At the center of that reason stood Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, whose presence within the royal family had long been defined not by spectacle, but by substance. Her contributions, though often understated, had quietly shaped the modern image of duty engagements carried out without complaint, responsibilities handled without fanfare, and a commitment that insiders often describe as unwavering. Together, Edward and Sophie had formed something rare within the monarchy, a partnership that functioned not as performance, but as quiet strength. They were, by many accounts, a stabilizing force during periods of uncertainty, stepping in when needed, holding the line when others stepped back. And perhaps that is why the events of that evening carried such weight, because what appeared to some as a simple breach of protocol felt to others like something far more personal, something that struck at the very foundation of respect they had spent years earning. Reports suggest that Edward had sensed a shift long before the dinner itself. Subtle changes, small adjustments. Moments that might have gone unnoticed by outsiders, but not by someone so deeply attuned to the inner workings of the institution. Those familiar with palace dynamics whisper that concerns had been quietly raised, not in confrontation, but in caution. A recognition that the balance was changing, that roles once clearly defined were beginning to blur. And yet, nothing had prepared him for what unfolded in that single moment. Guests seated nearby would later be described as noticing a difference in his demeanor even before he stood, a stillness, a tightening, as though a decision had already been made internally. When the moment came, it was not chaotic. There was no visible anger, no outward display of emotion. Instead, it was controlled, deliberate, and unmistakably intentional. Edward rose, not in haste, but with purpose. The kind of movement that does not seek attention, yet commands it completely. Conversations faltered, the rhythm of the evening disrupted not by noise, but by absence. And in that silence, the message became impossible to ignore. This was not a reaction born of impulse. It was a statement. Quiet, measured, but powerful enough to cut through the layers of ceremony that had defined the night. Behind the scenes, palace aides were said to be scrambling, not in panic, but in urgency. The kind of controlled response that comes when something unexpected threatens to unravel a carefully managed narrative. Questions were raised, explanations sought, but answers remained elusive. Because how do you explain something that was never meant to happen in the first place? How do you contain a moment that speaks louder than any official statement ever could? And as the evening continued, attempting to regain its composure, the reality began to settle, and this was not an isolated incident. Yet Edward's reaction didn't come out of nowhere. It was the culmination of a much larger shift within the monarchy. Since the coronation, Queen Camilla's role has evolved rapidly, some say naturally, others say strategically. But behind the polished appearances and carefully curated engagements, insiders whisper of a growing influence that has begun to reshape the very structure of royal hierarchy. What once appeared to be a steady transition into a supportive position has, according to various interpretations, transformed into something far more complex. Because in an institution where roles are defined not just by title but by tradition, any shift, no matter how gradual, carries consequences that ripple far beyond the surface. And as Camilla's presence has expanded, so too has the scrutiny surrounding it. In the early days following the coronation of King Charles III, her increased visibility was seen by many, as expected, even necessary. A monarch does not stand alone, and the role of a consort has always required adaptation. Yet, over time, what began as support appeared to evolve into something more central, more defining. State engagements, once carefully balanced among senior members of the royal family, began to reflect a subtle but noticeable shift. Camilla was no longer simply present, she was prominent. And while that prominence aligned with her official position, insiders suggest that the manner in which it expanded raised quiet questions within the firm. Because visibility in the monarchy is never neutral. It signals influence, and influence, when it grows, inevitably alters the balance of power. Reports suggest that alongside this increased visibility came efforts, whether intentional or circumstantial, to consolidate that influence further. Not through overt declarations, but through a series of incremental changes that, taken individually, might have seemed insignificant. Adjustments to appearances, shifts in representation, evolving roles in key events. Each one subtle, each one defensible, yet collectively forming a pattern that some within the palace began to notice. And with that pattern came speculation. Because in a system built on continuity, any sense of redirection can feel like disruption. Adding another layer to this evolving dynamic were the quiet expansions of the Parker Bowles family's presence. Nothing formal, nothing publicly declared, but enough to draw attention among those who monitor the intricate web of royal associations. Insiders whisper that connections once considered peripheral began to feel closer, more integrated into the broader narrative of royal life. And while such developments may have been entirely coincidental, their timing coinciding with Camilla's rising influence did not go unnoticed. Because within the monarchy, proximity is rarely accidental. It is interpreted, analyzed, and often questioned. Inevitably, this shifting landscape created friction. Not open conflict, not visible confrontation, but a quiet tension that settled beneath the surface. Traditionalists within the firm, those who view the monarchy as a structure that must remain anchored in precedent, are said to have grown increasingly cautious. Staff, too, reportedly found themselves navigating a changing environment where priorities seemed to be evolving in ways that were not always clearly defined. Some adapted quickly, aligning themselves with the new direction. Others hesitated, uncertain of what these changes meant for the institution they had long served. And in that uncertainty, divisions began to form, not dramatic, not overt, but present nonetheless. Perhaps most telling, according to various interpretations, was the subtle sidelining of long-serving royals. Not through exclusion, but through repositioning. Roles adjusted, visibility recalibrated. Influence redistributed in ways that were difficult to quantify yet impossible to ignore. For those who had spent years, even decades, building their place within the monarchy, these changes carried an unspoken weight. Because in a system where every role is earned through time and service, even the slightest shift can feel like a redefinition of worth. And it is within this evolving structure, this delicate shifting balance, that the events of the state dinner begin to take on a deeper meaning. And at the heart of this growing tension stood King Charles, caught between loyalty and legacy. King Charles has spent a lifetime preparing for the crown, but ruling under pressure is something no monarch can truly rehearse. With health concerns lingering and internal divisions surfacing, every decision now carries consequences that stretch far beyond a single evening. For King Charles III, the weight of leadership has never been theoretical. It is constant, unrelenting, and now, perhaps more than ever, deeply personal. Reports suggest that in recent months, the strain has intensified not only because of the responsibilities of the crown, but because of the growing complexity within his own household. The monarchy, often perceived as immovable, has always relied on balance. And when that balance begins to shift, even slightly, the pressure at the center becomes almost impossible to ignore. There is, according to those familiar with palace dynamics, an increasing reliance on a smaller, more trusted inner circle. Decisions that might once have been distributed across a broader network are now said to be handled with greater caution, greater control. It is not necessarily a sign of weakness, but of necessity. Because when uncertainty grows, so too does the need for clarity. And yet, that clarity is not always easy to achieve when competing priorities begin to surface. On one side stands the undeniable presence of Queen Camilla, whose evolving role has become central to the monarchy's current identity. On the other stands the delicate fabric of family unity, woven over decades and now showing signs of strain. Balancing those two forces is not simply a matter of preference, it is a test of leadership. Insiders whisper that following the state dinner, private discussions took place behind closed doors. Conversations that were described not as confrontational, but as deeply serious. The kind of discussions where every word carries weight, where silence can speak louder than agreement. What was said, what was decided, remains unclear. But the very fact that such conversations occurred suggests that the events of that evening could not be dismissed as insignificant. Because within the monarchy, moments like these are rarely isolated, they are indicators. Signals that something deeper is unfolding beneath the surface. Pressure, too, is said to be mounting from within the family itself. Senior royals, those who have long understood the importance of cohesion, are believed to be urging for clarity, for resolution, for a reaffirmation of principles that have traditionally guided the institution. Not through public statements or visible actions, but through quiet insistence. Because the strength of the monarchy has never come from perfection, it has come from its ability to endure, to adapt, and, when necessary, to correct itself. And yet, correction requires acknowledgement. It requires the willingness to confront what may be uncomfortable, even within the most private of settings. History offers its own quiet warnings. The monarchy has faced internal divisions before, moments where personal relationships and institutional responsibilities collided in ways that left lasting marks. Each time, the outcome has shaped not only the present, but the future. And now, as observers begin to draw subtle parallels, the question becomes unavoidable. Is this another such moment? Or is it something entirely different, something that reflects a changing monarchy navigating an uncertain era? What remains undeniable is the fragility of the public image. In an age where perception can shift in an instant, the events of a single evening can echo far beyond their immediate context. The walkout, the seating arrangement, the silence that followed, all of it feeds into a narrative that the monarchy must carefully manage. Because while the institution is built on tradition, it is sustained by trust. And trust, once questioned, is not easily restored. But what happened after the dinner may prove far more significant than the walkout itself. Once the cameras were gone and the guests had left, the real drama began. Behind closed palace doors, conversations reportedly turned, urgent voices lowered, decisions weighed, and alliances quietly tested in ways the public would never fully see. The carefully maintained composure of the evening gave way to something far more complex, something that could not be managed through ceremony or polished appearances. Within minutes, According to those familiar with the internal rhythm of royal operations, senior aides began moving with unusual speed, not in panic, but with a sense of controlled urgency that signaled the gravity of what had just occurred. Because while the public had witnessed a moment, those inside the institution understood it as a rupture subtle, but significant enough to demand immediate attention. Emergency discussions, it is whispered, unfolded in private offices and quiet corridors, away from the reach of speculation yet already shaped by it. The focus was not simply on what had happened, but on how it would be perceived, how it would be interpreted once it inevitably reached beyond palace walls. In an institution where perception often carries as much weight as reality, the need to contain the narrative became as critical as understanding the event itself. Reports suggest that multiple versions of the evening sequence were quietly reviewed, each one attempting to frame the moment in a way that would minimize disruption. Yet the challenge was clear. How do you soften an action that was never meant to be seen? At the same time, there were indications that Prince Edward and Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, had chosen to withdraw earlier than expected, their departure described not as abrupt, but as deliberate. Those close to the situation suggest that this decision was not made lightly. It carried the weight of years of accumulated observations, of moments that had perhaps been overlooked until they could no longer be ignored. And while no public explanation was offered, the absence itself became a statement, one that did not require words to be understood. Inside the palace, staff were reportedly instructed to maintain strict silence. No clarifications, no unofficial briefings, no attempts to engage with the growing wave of curiosity. The response, if it could be called that, was absence. A carefully chosen no-comment stance that, rather than closing the story, seemed to deepen it. Because silence in moments like these rarely erases questions, it amplifies them. And as the hours passed, those questions began to multiply. Media inquiries, as expected, began to increase rapidly. Requests for confirmation, for context, for even the smallest detail that might explain what had unfolded. Yet each inquiry met the same response: measured, restrained, and ultimately uninformative. According to various interpretations, this was not a failure to respond, but a strategy. A decision to allow the moment to settle before attempting to shake its meaning. But strategy comes with risk, because in the absence of clear answers, speculation fills the void. And speculation, once it takes hold, is difficult to contain. Behind the scenes, internal reviews of protocol decisions were said to have begun almost immediately. Not as an admission of error, but as a necessary step in understanding how such a moment had been allowed to occur. Every detail, every adjustment, every last-minute change reportedly examined with renewed scrutiny. Because in a system built on precision, even the smallest deviation demands explanation. And as those explanations were quietly sought, one reality became increasingly clear: this was not just about one evening, one decision, or one reaction. It was part of something larger, something that had been developing beneath the surface for far longer than anyone had publicly acknowledged. Still, the impact of that single moment was already spreading far beyond palace walls. In the age of instant headlines and viral speculation, it took only minutes for the story to escape the palace gates. And once it did, the reaction was swift, divided, and impossible to contain. What had begun as a controlled internal moment quickly transformed into a global conversation, one that no statement, no silence, and no carefully measured response could fully restrain. Within moments, fragments of the evening's subtle movements, brief exchanges, the now unmistakable walkout were captured, shared, and dissected with relentless intensity. Social media became the new court of analysis, where every second was replayed, slowed down, and examined as though it held the key to understanding something far larger than a single event. Clips circulated rapidly, each one offering a slightly different perspective, a slightly different interpretation. Some focused on the moment Prince Edward rose from his seat, others on the stillness that followed, the silence that seemed to echo louder with each replay. Observers began to analyze body language, timing, even the reactions of those seated nearby, searching for clues that might confirm what many were beginning to suspect: that this was not spontaneous, not accidental, but deeply intentional. And as those interpretations multiplied, so did the sense that something significant had just unfolded, something that could not be easily dismissed or explained away. Royal commentators, often cautious in their assessments, found themselves navigating a delicate balance. One hand, there was a clear need to avoid speculation that could not be substantiated. On the other, there was the undeniable weight of what had been witnessed. Some described it as a rare break in protocol, others as a moment of quiet assertion, and a few those more attuned to the subtleties of royal dynamics hinted at deeper tensions that had been building over time. Comparisons began to surface, drawing parallels to past moments in royal history where internal divisions had briefly emerged into public view. Not identical, not directly comparable, but similar enough to raise questions about patterns, about cycles, about the ways in which the monarchy responds when its internal balance is challenged. Public reaction, however, was far less restrained. Sympathy appeared to lean toward Edward and Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, whose long-standing reputation for quiet service seemed to resonate strongly in contrast to the unfolding narrative. Many viewed the moment not as disruption, but as a stand measured, respectful, yet firm. A reflection, perhaps, of values that some feared were being overshadowed in a rapidly evolving royal landscape. At the same time, scrutiny intensified around Queen Camilla, not through direct accusation, but through growing curiosity about her expanding role and influence. Because in the absence of clear answers, attention inevitably shifts toward those perceived to be at the center of change. Media outlets, citing unnamed palace insiders, began to add layers to the narrative, each report offering fragments of insight without full clarity. Some suggested internal disagreements, others pointed to shifts in protocol, while a few hinted at broader structural changes within the monarchy itself. And as these narratives overlapped, a larger debate began to take shape, one that extended beyond individuals and into the very identity of the institution. Was this a sign of modernization, a necessary evolution in a changing world? Or was it a departure from tradition, a disruption of the very principles that have long defined the monarchy's stability? That question, unresolved and increasingly urgent, lingered beneath every headline, every discussion, every analysis. Because while the moment itself was striking, its implications were far more complex. It was no longer just about what happened, but about what it represented, about the direction in which the monarchy might be moving, and the tensions that come with that movement. But beneath the noise and speculation lies a deeper question: what does this mean for the future of the monarchy? Moments like these are rarely just moments, they are signals. Signals of change, of tension, of a system quietly redefining itself under pressure. And as the dust settles, one thing becomes clear: the monarchy is once again being tested from within. What unfolded that evening did not begin or end with a single decision, a single reaction, or a single silence. It revealed something deeper, something far more complex. Because the monarchy has always existed in a delicate balance between tradition and transformation, between the weight of history and the demands of the present. And when that balance begins to shift, even slightly, the effects are never contained to one moment. They ripple outward, shaping perceptions, influencing relationships, and quietly redefining the institution itself. At the center of that shifting balance now stand Prince Edward and Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, whose roles, long defined by consistency and quiet dedication, appear to be entering a new phase. Not one marked by sudden change, but by subtle recalibration. The events of that evening, according to various interpretations, may serve as a turning point, not because they demand attention, but because they command reflection. Their place within the monarchy has never relied on visibility alone, but on trust, on continuity, on a steady presence that anchors the institution during uncertain times. And yet, as the structure around them evolves, the question becomes unavoidable. How will that role adapt without losing what made it essential in the first place? At the same time, the influence of Queen Camilla remains under careful and increasing scrutiny. Not in overt criticism, but in quiet observation, in the kind of attention that grows when change feels both significant and uncertain. Her position, undeniably central, continues to evolve in ways that shape the monarchy's present identity. And with that evolution comes a level of responsibility that extends beyond individual presence. It touches the broader perception of balance within the royal family. Because influence, when it expands, must also withstand examination. It must align not only with authority, but with the expectations that have long defined the institution's stability. For King Charles III, this moment represents perhaps one of the most complex challenges of his reign. Not because it demands immediate action, but because it requires careful navigation. The responsibility to maintain unity within a structure built on both personal relationships and public duty is not easily managed. It is a constant negotiation between loyalty and legacy, between the needs of the present and the expectations of the future. And as pressure continues to build from within the family, from public perception, from the quiet weight of history, the path forward becomes increasingly narrow, because every decision now carries not only consequence, but meaning. Public perception, too, plays an undeniable role in shaping what comes next. In an era where every moment can be captured, shared, and interpreted within seconds, the monarchy no longer exists solely within its own walls. It is observed, analyzed, and in many ways, defined by how it is perceived beyond them. Trust, once assumed, must now be continually reinforced. And moments like these, however subtle, have the power to influence that trust in ways that extend far beyond their immediate context. Because the monarchy does not simply operate, it is experienced, interpreted, and ultimately judged. History offers quiet echoes of similar tensions, moments when internal divisions surface just enough to remind the world that even the most enduring institutions are not immune to strain. Each time, the monarchy has adapted, sometimes slowly, sometimes under pressure, but always with an awareness that its survival depends not on perfection, but on resilience. And now, as those echoes begin to feel closer, more relevant, the question of legacy becomes impossible to ignore. Not just what will be preserved, but how it will be carried forward and by whom. Because beneath everything, the ceremony, the structure, the carefully maintained image, lies a fundamental truth. The monarchy is not static. It evolves, it adjusts, it responds. But in doing so, it must decide what it is willing to change and what it must protect at all costs. And that decision, perhaps more than any single moment, will define what comes next. Because in the end, the monarchy isn't defined by where people sit, but by what happens when someone decides they won't stay seated. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.